When Conrad Roy was considering suicide, Michelle Carter goaded him to go ahead and do it. In the middle of poisoning himself with carbon monoxide, Roy reconsidered, got out of his loaded truck, and texted her his fears. She ordered him to get back in and finish the job. He did. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but apparently words can be found to hurt you. Proxy violence is the use of a representative or alternate force to achieve violence against a target without committing a direct assault, and often without looking guilty of anything. There are types of proxy violence which are societal, but today we're going to focus on individual use of it. This is usually an extreme form of relational aggression, or aggression in which harm is caused by damaging someone's relationship or social status, a la Mean Girls, where a person achieves her violent intent by inspiring, persuading, paying, or tricking someone else into aggression against her target. This is not to say that being a proxy for another individual's violent intent absolves the direct aggressor of any guilt or responsibility. If you do something, it's your action, your choice, and your fault. However, that a proxy committed the violent act does not absolve the instigator either. Getting someone to do your dirty work for you doesn't change the fact that it is your dirty work. In light of that, it is to be understood that while direct violence may have one perpetrator and therefore one guilty party, when proxy violence occurs, there are always at least two. The instigator and the proxy are both at fault for the damage done by the proxy's violent actions. So, how does proxy violence happen? The first thing likely to come to mind is the use of hired killers, a practice which represents a confounding factor in statistics on intimate partner homicides, which feminists often quote as evidence that men are more abusive than women. When a woman, unwilling or unable to take the risk herself, hires someone else to kill her partner, his death isn't going to be listed as a murder by an intimate partner because there was no intimate relationship with the actual killer. Neither will a love triangle murder, in which a wife persuades her new lover to help her get rid of a no longer wanted partner, either with promises of rewards or through manipulation of insecurity and jealousy. Both the instigator and the killer are responsible for the deed, but intimate partner homicide statistics won't reflect the instigator's part in her partner's death in either situation. Another area of proxy violence that has begun to receive more public attention in the last few years is abuse that leads to the victim self-harming, with reports of teens bullied by their peers and in some cases even parents, until the victim resorted to suicide to escape public humiliation or other abuse. The proxy in this type of violence is the victim's own psychological welfare, broken down by the abuser's systematic destruction of every reason he or she has to live, often starting with the victim's self-image. Also making the news, though with less sympathetic coverage, have been the suicides of fathers like Chris Mackney and Thomas Ball, denied their relationships with their children and forced into impossible financial situations by their ex-wives' exploitation of gynocentric family law. Then there was Earl Silverman, driven to suicide by feminists for doing the very thing they claim men's rights activists should but never do: trying to run a shelter for abused men. Abusers who do this respond to their victims' suicides by attacking the legitimacy of the victim's experiences and responses, blaming mental illness regardless of diagnosis, and even character flaws, and sometimes going so far as to play victim by classifying the suicide as an act of aggression against the abuser. Michelle Carter's attorneys unsuccessfully used some of these arguments in her defense against prosecution for talking Conrad Roy out of deciding not to kill himself. This is one instance of victim blaming to which feminists rarely seem to object, at least when the victim is male. They didn't even wait for Earl Silverman's body to get cold before grave-standing on his tragedy to blame the men's rights community for not doing something feminists never did, but often claim credit for anyway: creating and supporting a costly network of victim shelters with no financial assistance. How dare those lazy MRAs fail to spin straw into gold when feminists have spent 40 years claiming to have done so? And pay no attention to the massive body of government and charity grants behind the lace curtain. Another proxy violence method is white knighting, wherein bystanders respond to the instigator's victim signaling by engaging in violence against her perceived antagonist, often with little or no evidence and no effort at due process. Where gynocentrism and mob mentality intersect, a woman's tears can get a man assaulted, even killed. I'd suggest asking some victims: Emmett Till, Donald Robinson, Luke Harwood, Manos Economides, or Syed Farid Khan. But that would be futile. The dead don't give interviews. An easier to trace, but largely unaddressed type of proxy violence is the exploitation of police force as a tool of aggression, wherein the state is used as a Rube Goldberg husband-battering device. In past episodes, we've talked about the phenomenon of using false accusations as a tool of abuse. Karen even made an analogy, pointing out that if a woman hired mercenaries to kidnap her ex, beat him up and rob him, tie him up and lock him in a shed over the weekend, they'd be violating all kinds of laws. But she can lie to the cops, claim he hit her, and they'll do a pretty close approximation to that by hauling him off to jail and locking him up until he posts bail. This type of violence could largely be prevented by making prosecution mandatory when perjury and false charges are blatant and obvious. However, feminists have argued against such measures, claiming they would discourage women from reporting violent crimes. They also argue that if a man is innocent, he has nothing to fear. In the same vein, then, if a woman's statement is true, she has nothing to fear from prosecution for these crimes. The only remedy against proxy violence is to hold instigators accountable whenever possible within the guidelines of due process, regardless of their excuses. Again, that would not absolve their proxies of accountability for violent acts. It would just make using a proxy less likely to protect an instigator from legal consequences for harm done at her request. Hello and welcome to Badger Talk number 6, Proxy Violence, a Woman's Not-So-Secret Weapon. I'm Hannah Wallen, and today I'm here with Woozle Slayer Karen Strawn, our resident scholar Aidan Paladin, that adorable specter of death, Prim Reaper, and the ever-present neutered doge, Brian Martinez. Ladies, is this topic bothering you? Why don't you let us take care of it?
Are you all right?
Karen, I heard a squeal there.
Yeah, no, the side tube just keeps playing and playing and playing.
Just close it. Just close it. We don't need it anymore.
Oh, okay. Well, geez, you could have told me
Voted him to go ahead and do it.
I think I'll hire someone to deal with you, Doge.
Damn you, Karen. Damn you to hell.
You know, hey, I can use proxies. Sorry to interrupt.
Huh?
Well, that's what proxies are for. That's what proxies are for.
So, the topic, proxy violence. I thank you for crediting me with the analogy. I've actually had men who have been through that email me and essentially say thank you for putting it in those terms, because it really did. It was essentially, that was my experience. I was kidnapped. I was taken forcibly from my house. I was, locked in a room, right? Like this is what happened to me. And it didn't feel any different just because it was the police. It actually felt more terrifying because it was the police, because the police have that sort of air of legitimacy. So you don't know whether, you know that you will not be seen as a victim, right? You know when it's the police doing it that you will not be seen as having been victimized, the way you would if she'd hired her brother, or like talked her brothers into doing it, or hired somebody, or talked a new boyfriend into beating you up or something like that, right? So I think that there's a very like the feminists who say, no harm, no foul. He was found innocent. Like, he was found not guilty. And so, he can just get no, because he literally just had the state hold him down and attempt to commit crime, and essentially attempt to commit crimes on him, right? The entire fucking state. at a woman's behest who was lying, right? And if you were to say, okay, well, you were raped, but now it's over, no harm, no foul.
There are men who have been executed for crimes that they were found innocent of later on. Just saying that, oh, if you're innocent, it'll be just fine, doesn't really fly in those cases. In those cases and all the other cases, but in those ones in particular.
Well, what we find, consistently what we find with a lot of social psychological research, and specifically psychological research, sorry about that, is that sometimes even the non-physical violence has a greater long-lasting psychological negative impact than physical violence in many cases. So if you have been, bullied by the police, who have institutional power, and you have been, outcasted and castigated, that's more long-term psychologically probably damaging even than getting a punched in the face, which is terrible as well. But
I believe it, because what does that do to your faith in the system, right?
Well, I've seen it knock down guys' faith in the system. Actually, personally, I know at least 2 guys who break out in a cold sweat whenever there's a police officer around. And it's not because they're doing anything they're not supposed to be doing. It's because they know that the police officer may at some point do something that he's not supposed to be doing. And, at least not according to following the law. He may be supporting somebody who has lied, and he may drag the guy off at any time. This is something that it actually, I've seen it cause post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms in one of my friends. And he actually ended up getting diagnosed with that following a 7-year ordeal with false accusations and false arrest.
Well, I do want to address something Aidan Paladin said, which is the psychological bullying and things like that, and the psychological repercussions of just being shunned and outcast are often, more traumatic than being punched in the face. Well, of course they are. I mean, I've been punched in the face. It's really, if you aren't in fear for your safety or your life, being punched in the face is just it's just physical pain. It's not, people aren't made out of glass. It's no worse than falling on your face on the sidewalk, right? What is traumatic about being physically assaulted by, say, an intimate partner is that sense of betrayal, that they would want to hurt you in a way that is so obvious, or being assaulted by somebody in public. What's so traumatic about it isn't necessarily the punch in the face. It's the fear of, am I going to die? Right? That's what is traumatic about that. So, I mean, so much of this is tied up in emotional responses, fear, uncertainty, sense of intimidation, all of those things, right? So, I mean, essentially, the idea that physical violence is always going to be more traumatic than psychological abuse or whatever is absolutely, it's ridiculous. They're not the same thing. Otherwise, boxers would never go in the ring, or they'd all have PTSD.
Actually, the psychological thing is quite important. It's so important that it's even known for situations that really have nothing to do with criminal violence and things like that. If you've ever been involved in a competitive sport, just an important part of your competitiveness, an important part of the competition itself is to psych out your opponent. And it can be anything from simply looking confident and competent to, football players will say nasty things to each other before the play is called. Right down to, I'm going to eat you. So, I mean, we see this in other areas of life. So we know when we turn around and it's applied with a deliberate intent to cause harm to the person, that it's going to do it, and that the individual has evidence in their life somewhere that this works. So it's not as though we could consider this to be a lesser form of violence. It's also not as though we can consider the individual participating in it, the individual engaging in it, to have believed that, to think that they weren't doing anything wrong. They know exactly what they're doing. When you actually emotionally abuse a person, as opposed to, like, you get into arguments with people, and you might hear something nasty from somebody here and there. I get told all kinds of crap on Twitter, for instance. I don't consider that necessarily to be emotional abuse. But if, for instance, I don't know, the city came around a lot the last couple summers and very closely examined all of the cars in the parking lot at the apartment complex where I live to see if any of them had expired license plates or damage on the car or anything that, like, they put a paper on it and you had to prove the car was in running condition or they would tow it away and sell it. And I finally went out and badgered the guy because that kept coming and looking, because they're not really supposed to come around every couple of days like that. And they're not doing it in other neighborhoods. My neighborhood happens to be a lower income neighborhood. But it is a psychologically abusive thing, because you start to think, well, you know, if I get another scratch on my car, are they going to tow it away? My car's ugly. Are they going to tow it away? I've been pulled over for driving in a wealthy neighborhood with an ugly beat-up car before, and told I didn't belong there. So this is the kind of thing that, when you have a pattern like that, or when you have somebody who does something like talking somebody into suicide, when you have somebody who gives somebody the silent treatment as part of a partner relationship for years and years, all of these things are abuse that can lead to self-harm, which is proxy violence.
One of the things I wanted to mention real quick in relation to that too, and the topic in general, is that one thing that we do find, and I can only speak from what I know from my research and my courses I've taken in pedagogy, is that we start to find these males and females separate themselves into these different types of bullying behavior from an extremely early age of a difference between the genders. Women engage in more psychological violence from pretty much preschool forward, whereas males are more likely to engage in physical violence. And when we're talking about this psychological manipulation, the psychological violence, yeah, that starts real early on.
Well, what I think is important too is, you know, like, because they've only just really begun over the last 10 or 15 years or so to study what's called relational violence, which is what they have seen from that girls engage in almost sort of naturally. It's a natural thing. It's a go get an adult to act as a proxy to punish this person who has annoyed me, right? It's essentially, relational violence is tattling, backstabbing, rumor mongering, you know, spreading lies about people that you don't like, those kinds of things, trying to get them socially excluded, ostracized, shunned, beaten up, punished in some way, right? And relational aggression is it's, I mean, if you look at any of the sort of the classic literature out there, it's the tool of women. It is the tool that comes naturally to them. And it's because it comes with that plausible deniability. Oh, well, I didn't do anything. I just told the king to bring me the head of John the Baptist. I wasn't the one who ordered it, and I wasn't the one who, you know, chopped the dude's head off and put it on a platter, right? And so essentially what you have is this tool that women seem to, it seems to come naturally for them early on in their life. And then you have the obvious forms of aggression among boys, many of which I think are way overblown and way over policed, right? In terms of, you know, getting into a fight, it's an obvious thing. There are two people involved in the fight. They come away with injuries, you know, bruises, bloody noses, all of that, right? And so it's very, very obvious. It's very obvious who was involved. And I think one of the most interesting findings recently in the research is that boys start out using overt aggression with each other, which is, so that chest beating and the smack talk, the face-to-face, right in your face kind of aggression. That's what they commonly start out using, right? But by the time they're adults, right, they're using now relational aggression, because we have decided to target the primary ways that boys aggress, and often the ways that boys hash out their differences, right? And we've essentially outlawed all of them, right? So these boys have taken a lesson from girls, and by the time they're old enough to be in the workforce, now they're using backstabbing, now they're using rumor mongering, now they're using character assassination, now they're using all of these things that came naturally to the girls that they went to elementary school with, right? Tattling and all of those things, right? Now these guys are using it. And the problem that I see with this is exactly the problem, that the reason why it went unstudied for so long. It comes with plausible deniability. It's very easy to disavow any involvement. It's very easy to say, oh, I didn't mean for this to happen. I mean, this is what you showed a picture of that young boy in the intro, the young boy in the UK, 18 years old, who was beaten to death because a girl told her friends that he had raped her. And they decided to take justice into their own hands. And on the stand, she said, I didn't mean for, how could I have known this was going to happen? I didn't mean for this to happen. Well, I'm sorry, but, we need to be teaching girls and boys that the kinds of aggression that come with plausible deniability also result in serious consequences for people, right? Like, just because you didn't beat him with a tire iron and dismember his body and throw it in a river doesn't mean that you didn't play a part in what happened to that guy, right? And like, we need to actually try and instill in our kids, and this is the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not bear false witness. Why do you fucking think it's right up there with, like, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not, freaking covet thy neighbor's wife, thou shalt not bear false witness?
Well, I mean, it happens in childhood. Girls' proxy violence is minimized, but I mean, it also kind of translates into adulthood, where female crimes are given, what is it, like 60% less jail time than men?
Yeah, it's quite a bit. It's quite a bit.
Well, what do we expect women to think if everything they do is punished at that much lower of a rate than men?
Well, even when feminists complain, it's too much.
Even when they are the ones who are actually beating the guy with a lead pipe.
Well,
right?
or
They're
even
still going to serve less time.
Even
right?
when they've pointed a gun at him and shot him.
Yeah, the exact same crime, and they'll still get less time.
Yeah. So I mean, it's infuriating to me, because I see this, and I see what I see with and I'm going to share that lovely story about my son getting into a brawl in grade 3, and because his friend was being picked on and pushed around, and the older boys who were doing that started to hit him. And so my son just jumped in and started swinging, and accidentally kicked his friend in the nuts. Yes, but managed to put a stop to his friend being beaten up. And I get the package from the school. He gets detention. We get the package from the school, and he has to fill out all these things. What did you do wrong? What would you do differently next time? Right. And I know exactly what they expect him to answer is, go tell an adult. But I think we're simultaneously training boys out of this sort of very recognizable, very overt type of aggression that's easy to spot and easy to deal with because you can see it, right? We're training them out of that and we're training them into the female response, which is go tell the nearest thug who has the ability to, you know, punish the person, right? For whether justified or not, right? And at the same time, we're training boys out of the impulse to jump in, right? Like, so, I mean, in a generation, are we even going to hear any stories about, you know, young men who ran into a burning building and pulled somebody out, or, you know, ran towards the train wreck and started pulling out injured people? No, we're not, because that will have been essentially just crushed out of them, right? These are the people, these boys are the people who will, because of that impulse to jump in, right? When they see something happening that looks like somebody needs to jump in, we will have essentially trained that impulse out of them. And so I see a whole bunch of freaking things happening right now that I think are really not going to serve us in the long run. So
No, we're going to end up with a whole generation of lawyers now.
Something that's really interesting about that, I'm so sorry about the stupid cars, but there's a Dr. Allweiss who was really studying bullying in young children and found that the most successful bullies are the ones that did things away from the eyes of the people who could have the teachers or the administrators, whatever. They would do it away so it couldn't, there was no proof of it. One of the things that he did, because the Always program has been instituted in Finland, Sweden, Norway, and essentially it's been going on since about the late 80s, they pretty much eliminated early childhood bullying through this one very simple thing, which was to encourage other students to intervene. Exactly what you were saying, Karen, of being the boys to maybe their more natural proclivity to want to intervene and to want to stop, you know, this bullying where they see it. Instead, it's being replaced with go and tattle and tell the teacher, and it involved institutional power rather than you know, standing up and trying to even the playing ground.
Well, I think too, when you sort of look at the impulse on the part of boys, like what message is it sending to boys who have this natural proclivity to intervene? It's essentially telling them your way of doing things is wrong. Your way of doing things is bad. And, you know, regardless of the results, regardless of the outcome, maybe you stopped a bullying incident, but your way of doing it was bad. I also do want to bring up something interesting out of New Zealand. There was a study that was done. They managed to get 4 schools to sign off on it and allow participate, despite the legal liabilities involved, because you know how litigious parents can be. But the researchers they looked back at their own childhoods and that kind of, you know, sort of being booted out after lunch and being told to come home when the streetlights come on, and spending a lot of time unsupervised and having to hash things out among themselves and all of those things, right? And they were like, well, we survived our childhoods. Like, why does every kid need to be supervised all the time? Like, what's going on here? This is really weird. I climbed trees. I skateboarded without a helmet. I did all of these things. And we're cutting our kids off from all of these types of really awesome experiences, the experiences that make the best memories for us, right? So they instituted something called unsupervised recess at school, unsupervised no rules recess at 4 schools in New Zealand. And so there were no adults patrolling the school grounds. The adults were inside the school there if necessary in an emergency, but they were not walking around keeping an eye on things. And there were no rules. If you wanted to skateboard without a helmet, that's fine. If you wanted to climb a tree, that's fine. They provided these kids with construction waste and old tires to build forts and all kinds of stuff, right? And one thing that they found was number one, injuries went down instead of up. Stop it, dog. Injuries went... Dog! Injuries went down instead of up, but also bullying was pretty much eliminated. because the kids had better things to do, number one, than fight with each other and bully. And they had to do things, stop it, as a team. And then on top of that, they didn't have teachers to go to intervene in every problem. Enough. Oh my God, I'm gonna kill that dog.
How about
they didn't have a teacher to intervene in every conflict, and so they learned how to hash out conflicts on their own. And peer pressure, instead of authoritarian response, was the way that these things were sorted out. The other kid said, no, you're not going to treat that kid like that.
The Borks have ended now.
Oh my God, this dog. She's in heat. I'm sorry. Every time she sees a male dog walking by, she just goes nuts.
So the magic spell, though, to quiet the dog down is clapping your hands.
She wants the D.
She needs the D.
Yes. Okay, so I just wanted to come in and read off a super chat. We only got one so far, but if you guys put through some super chats, I will come in every few minutes and read them off. So Chris Meek gave us $5 Australian, I think, and writes Rube Goldberg husband bashing device in quotes, and then says, that's nice. You're in my thoughts, Brian. Be well. So thank you, Chris Meek, for the kind words, as well as the $5 Australian. And I also, well, I don't know if you guys are still talking about proxy violence on the individual level. If you are, I can wait. But I was thinking about.
No, go right ahead.
Okay, so I haven't written anything out, and it's just something I've been thinking about recently with all that's been going on with these protests and Antifa and the radical left and also now the new sort of, I say it's not new, but the Unite the Right rally, and then there was the Barcelona attack today with Islamic extremists. And I was thinking about the things that I've learned about these groups, things like the fact that By Any Means Necessary or BAM or Black Lives Matter, Antifa, there are a lot of women that actually run or they have a great deal of influence within those groups. By Any Means Necessary is actually run by two women. I believe they're teachers. One of them might be a high school teacher, and they essentially
she is a high school teacher.
Yes,
it's horrible. I can't remember her name, but
yeah, I know. But she's that little short Asian woman that just flips out on people.
Yvette Falarca.
Yes, that's right, Yvette Falarca. And they get young men mostly to join them, and then they like a cult, they radicalize them. And this is also what happens with Antifa. From reports that I've seen, there, from people who have observed or even been with them, there's a lot of female control in Antifa. If you go to the Black Lives Matter website and you trace it all the way back to the people who run it, it's operated by female feminists. Specifically womanists, because they're mostly women of color, feminists, and that they used to call them womanists in the 60s. There was a woman that the same one from Black Lives Matter that I think was wasn't she wanted for murder or something, and then she fled.
She's on the most wanted list. Yeah,
she's on the most wanted list, right? And then when you look at Islam, there are a lot of women that radicalize men into doing these terrorist acts. Either they're mothers that raise them, or they're women that are essentially, they use their social power to then get men to do this stuff for them. So I guess what I'm thinking about is I'm looking at this also as a way of essentially a larger scale politicized, version of proxy violence that where women use men. And I'm also thinking about the conditions that would need to be met for this to be possible. And so, because this isn't something that happens everywhere, but it certainly happens within these groups like Antifa, By Any Means Necessary, Black Lives Matter, and Radical Islam. So I guess I wanted to throw that out there. It's something I'm thinking about. I might be full of shit.
Well,
but
no,
it's
you're not.
I'm thinking about.
You're not.
So,
you're
okay.
not. You're not. I mean, Allison did a beautiful video called "Son of Threat Narrative." At least that was the primary title of it. The ugly narratives or the ugly memes or something like that. And it went, she described how women are used as sort of, and it really does kind of fall into that whole thing that Anita Sarkeesian said, that in the game of patriarchy, women aren't the opposing team, they're the ball, right? They are. I mean, women feature, very, very majorly in war propaganda. They're coming to rape our women. They're gonna the bad guys are gonna come over here and victimize our women. We have to. They're so awful. They're so evil that they mistreat, they abuse their own women. They hurt their own women. So women are often used as sort of these props in this game of conflict between groups of men.
Yeah, but I wouldn't call them the ball at that point. I would say they're the goal, and the referees, and the coaches, and the cheerleaders, and the cheering section, the crowd. And the ball would be the sense of belonging that you get from making the women happy.
That's right. And so I think essentially what we have here is a situation where women's power to orchestrate these kinds of situations where men are actually willing to go to war with each other. They're actually willing to kill each other. They're willing to risk their lives, right? For these women. I think, this is, nobody wants to look at that as a vulnerability that men have and a power that women have over men. And yet it recurs over and over and over and over throughout the entire canon of Western literature, all the way back through Greek mythology and Roman mythology and all of that other crap, right? That the man is willing to lay down his life on behalf of the virtuous woman, right? So as long as you can portray your women as virtuous, and unspoiled, giggity, then you have this tool, and the tool is used by women. It's also used by governments in order to get men to enlist, get men to be willing to die, be put through the meat grinder of trench warfare, all of those things, right? Be willing to run into enemy bullets. This is and the feminist narrative places women in a position where they are essentially helpless, but to be used in this way, right? They have no choice but to be used in this way. They are mere objects to the patriarchal forces around them. They are merely the substrate, to quote Allison, the substrate upon which men's actions are written, right? Eve Ensler put it, women are the ground upon which men wage war, right? I mean, if you want to talk about objectification, look at the way feminists talk about women when it comes to human conflict, right? They're never the instigators. They never have any kind of power in this situation. They merely lie down and become the battlefield, right? And that's absolutely obscene to me, because women are so much a part of war efforts, and they are very much a part of stirring up national sentiment, nationalistic sentiment. The feminists of the KKK, right? You literally have groups of women who are there to, they're in the background, but they're pulling a lot of strings. And honestly, I think absolutely you have it 100% correct, Brian. It is the men who end up being the face of these kinds of movements, but it's often the women who are the ones who are deciding how everything falls out. And they are making the decisions that mean the lives or deaths of men.
Something I want to add to that, but I'm going to let Aiden, because she put her name in there first.
Oh, real quick, it's not even just in our literature, it's intertwined into our very biology. Because of the fact that women can only produce one offspring at a time, whereas men can plow many fields, or some other, kind of metaphor for that, it makes sense. Women are to be protected. They are necessary for the propagation of the human species, for the preservation of your tribe. So it makes sense from not just from a literary standpoint, not from a historical standpoint, but from a very basic evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychological standpoint, why women are held to this extremely high value. At the same time, though, yeah, we don't ever seemingly put women as having any fault in or having any stake in the game.
Agency.
Yes, they have no agency. Exactly, they have no agency when very much they have the strongest role as being the ones who carry on and produce the next generation. The men are more expendable. That's simply the way that our biology works. And as such, yeah, we see that in pretty much every aspect of society. So when feminists act as if women have no agency, or as if we need to be protected on all of these other levels outside of the ones that we already get, that's an absurdity, and it totally denies reality.
And the thing I wanted to add in that there's something else I've been thinking about is the other side of this. So, or what I think might be the other side, because I haven't looked at it that closely. But on the one hand, you have these, very female-led Oedipal style groups like By Any Means Necessary, like Antifa, like Black Lives Matter, that are essentially using these class struggle ideas to push forward these their politics, their acts of terrorism, basically domestic terrorism. And for example, in the Black Lives Matter example, it started because men were being killed, but Black women started Black Lives Matter. Black women made themselves the bigger victims, and Black women essentially created the culture around BLM to essentially put women first, even though men were the victims at the time. But people have all forgotten. In fact, if you look at narratives that you see in the propaganda and stuff in Hollywood that's trying to make a statement about, Black violence, or Blacks being the victims of violence, they use women more often. They use little girls. They have, this kind of stuff, even though they're way less likely to be affected. And it's got more to do with them being men than it has to do with them being Black. But that as an aside, on so when you create that as a I don't know, as a woman that's I guess that's socialist leanings, and you want to use this power, and feminists are socialists, they are far left wing ideologues. This is super convenient for them, and they get to use men like the cannon fodder that they are to accomplish their ends. And a lot of times, the kind of men they're attracting, and this is what I'm getting at. The kind of men that they usually attract are the kind of men that feel either they have a sense of duty to the women's, because, milady, we got to protect the women's, or there might be another aspect to it, like they're looking to atone for the sin of being male or of being white or whatever it is. So in Antifa, when you see all these white guys that are breaking Starbucks and knocking over trash cans, I think they're seeking to make good so that these women see them do it, and that they will, I think that there's a bit of guilt that comes with it that's imposed on them by the people who lead it. Now, that might be something that people might say, well, these are sort of beta male traits, right? Like they tend to attract betas, is what the people will say. And I guess that, you could probably find some truth to that, although I don't know that would work when you're looking at Islam, but maybe that's how it works too. Maybe those are the kinds of guys that will drive into a crowd or blow themselves up or essentially throw their lives away because they haven't been able to accomplish much, and they want to die heroes and be immortalized, so they go and engage in this risky behavior. And when they do, it's women that celebrate them in Islam, right? They're the ones that get praised and shit, right? So on the flip side of this, when I looked at the stuff going on the right, well, what they're calling themselves, the alt-right folks that are gathering, and you see them, and it's like these white men again that are, they're gathering together with their tiki torches. And I looked at that and I tried to understand where that comes from. And I think that there is a relationship. I think that you have a society, and this is like the symptoms of this, where there are men on both sides that are looking for meaning. They're looking for something to identify with, either as being part of a group like BLM or Antifa or by any means necessary, whatever, or if they are looking to like take back their masculinity, take back what they are, and be proud of it when they go and become part of the alt-right or just right wing or whatever it is all these different sort of subgroups in that side too. And so I see an increase in that, and I'm thinking, are these men looking for a place where they can basically get some value, because they're getting these men are being shat on all sides just for being men, and in many cases for being white men too, on top of that. So they're looking for a place to belong. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll give you guys the floor back, is the popularity of Professor Jordan B. Peterson. When he talks about who watches his content the most, it's men. It's young men that are looking for something. They are desperate for a sense of meaning, a sense of responsibility, a sense of belonging with something. And Jordan Peterson provides that to these people. And I don't think that these things are disconnected. I think that they're intricately connected, and it's just different ways that guys are trying to find answers to their questions about, why am I here? What is the point of all this? Where do I belong? Where do I fit in? What can I do to make the world better? What is the answer? And I think that there's a connection to all that stuff. If you look at the fact that Peterson's base is like over 90% male, I mean, it could also be because men tend to be more interested in that topic, but I think that there's something there. So anyway, something to think about. This is what I've been playing around with in my head. I guess just, take that for what it's will. And I will read one more super chat that we just got. Zaranx gives us $5, and he says, Antifa, BAMN, and BLM, see Jordan B. Peterson on Oedipal Mother, which is what I was talking about. He also gives us $10. Thank you, Zaranx. And says, white women were killed at a rate of 4-1 versus black women, 42-13 respectively. And then links us to a Guardian article. So that's all I got to say about that. Tell me if I'm full of shit, but otherwise, that's it.
I don't think you're full of shit. I think that a lot of men are being disenfranchised these days, and probably a lot of white people. I mean, there is a lot of white bashing going on online. It's a little absurd how more people aren't calling this out. I've heard it called many times the last form of acceptable racism. And I do think that people on either sides of these large, often violent groups are misguided. I don't think there aren't women involved in these large groups. And you said so yourself. There are women like pushing the notion of men marching in that group. But to act like it's only men that have these thoughts and that there aren't any women involved at all, it just seems misguided. It's not to say that this whole thing isn't misguided, but that focusing on that in particular just seems really silly to me.
Karen?
Do we still have a Karen?
Sorry, I don't think the presence of women negates the idea that that they might have been a men's rights group, because what are we? We're female men's rights people, right? We have an interest in it, right? But it's not about, it's very, very much about white preservation, white preservation, white supremacy, white identity, all of those things. And frankly, if the left is going to have identity politics, the right is going to follow suit. That's just the way it is. And what I find the most interesting about all of this is that you have like, there is this narrative, right? Like, there's a reason why white men are the only version of a human being that it's okay to bash. It's okay to shit on them. It's okay to, but why is that? Because they are consistently presented as the group that is on top. And that has to be intoxicating for a lot of men. And Benjamin Boyce, actually, he just uploaded a video today and he said that essentially white guilt is the ultimate form of white arrogance, because what you're doing with white guilt is you're essentially saying my whiteness, right, is so amazing that it's responsible for everything, right? It's responsible for everything. And I think that that there's something very, very attractive to a lot of men who join feminism, a lot of men who join these sort of left-wing groups, white men in particular, white straight men, in that they may have, like, and because a lot of them are kind of these wiry little fuck ups who, you know, with scraggly beards and, you know, like they're not exactly Jason Statham, okay? These guys. All right? And it gives them like Jordan Peterson said, it gives them a field on which they can compete with other men and distinguish themselves. Okay? And on top of that, they are able, and I mean, this was exemplified in that freaking the article that we ran Zerked yesterday, Allison and me, and you know, that essentially the one good man syndrome, because like the one good man, he can't bash black men, he can't bash, you know, Indian men, he can't bash Aboriginal men, he can't bash gay men, but he can bash straight white men and distinguish himself as the one good man who is, you know, like Cenk Uygur kind of tried to sell himself to me during our interview, right? None of those men back then would have given the women the vote, but me, I would have been the one good man who would have done it, right? I would have given it to them before they asked. I'm that good. I'm that much better than all the other men, right? And so I think that because there is this field of white men out there that it's perfectly fine to shit on, right? What we see is we see all of these guys in Antifa, and so we don't see the same types of men in these white nationalist groups as we see in Antifa and feminism and all of these other sort of left-wing groups, right? We see essentially sort of the epitomized by that clip from the Warren Farrell protest of 2014. You know, the dude, we don't really want to talk to you guys, but like we're here to shut down an event that promotes patriarchy, right? Those are the guys that Antifa is recruiting, right? Those are not necessarily the same guys, these skinny, flat-chested, you know, guys who can't grow a beard, right? A proper beard. No, the white nationalists are actually recruiting high testosterone men, right? I actually believe this because they're recruiting on a different metric, right? These I guess you would, I hate to say it, these beta cucks, whatever you want to call them, that are aligning themselves with the far left, right? They are men who cannot compete with other men on any other playing field other than one where the rules are that they can bash white men to their heart's content and, you know, AIDS Skrillex, you know, those kinds of men. And that's perfectly permissible, and they can distinguish themselves in that way. Whereas the guys who are being recruited by white nationalists are higher testosterone males. They are aligning themselves along racial lines, but they're also essentially saying, I'm not going to be bashed, right? I'm not going to fucking put up with it, right? And so we see this sort of, it's this horrible, horrible fucking, and I don't want to say women are the problem because, you know, like women are not the only problem. Male nature is a huge freaking player in this game, right? the need to distinguish oneself, the need to, like, set oneself up to compete in a dominance hierarchy. Well, when your competition is AIDS Skrillex, how masculine do you have to fucking be, right?
By no means would I want to imply that it's only a woman problem, but a
Yeah.
lot of people seem to be saying that there are no women involved at all, and that's
I know,
also
I know.
the case.
I know, and there are absolutely women in the background, and they're pulling the strings, they're egging the men on, they are being used by other men against each other. The whole thing's a fucking mess.
Well, there are also women in the foreground. I mean, I hate to be the one to say it this way, or maybe I don't, because I say stuff
Well, it's
all the
only
time that...
Antifa.
No,
it's only
seriously.
Antifa that sticks its women
out in the front.
Sticks its women right at the front,
Uh-huh.
right? And they aren't doing it. They aren't doing it for equality.
There's women in the forefront of Black Lives Matter too, and there's women in the forefront of all of these groups. If there were not women in the forefront of these groups, if there were not women out there marching and carrying signs and getting in people's faces and stuff like that, there would not have been one in a position to get hit by that car.
True. And what gets me is that you can see the reasoning on the part of all of these far left groups, because I didn't see any women right at the front of the charge of the neo-Nazis or the white supremacists or whatever you want to fucking alt-right protest.
Well, I was going to say, to classify them as white supremacists is sometimes it's a little dishonest, because you have a lot of people involved in the alt-right who are simply tired of being told that their demographic makes them automatically evil and automatically oppressive and automatically privileged and so on, when they've got a lot of things that are not going for them. Many of them are living in poverty. Many of them are lower middle class. Many of them have had hardships in their lives. Some of them have faced hardships because they've been denied things because they weren't the right sex or race to get them. So you're not just dealing with people who are... Like, for me to call someone a supremacist, they have to think they're better than everybody else. And they have to think that they have to preserve a purity of their genetic line because they're better than everybody else. Not because they don't want to be drowned out by people trying to get rid of them, but because they're better than everyone else. A supremacist is like those feminists that say they want to drop men down to 10% of the population that gets kept for breeding purposes. That's a supremacist. You know, the feminists that sit around in a coffee shop and say, well, women have it worse and women need this and women need that. They're whiny. They're whiny cunts. But they're not, I wouldn't necessarily call them supremacists. They have to turn around and say, well, women are better than you. You know, they'd have to make the Anna Kasparian speech there. I'm better than you.
Yeah. You better believe I'm better than you. But I do agree, right? But I don't want to, I don't want to end up like Theron Meyer and getting attacked for not being like, for not condemning that particular side enough, right? It really is like you got two soccer teams and the fans all freaking have a brawl and you condemn both sets of fans, and then Manchester United's fans go, oh, you're siding with Arsenal, right? Because you didn't pick our side, right? You condemned us both, so you're siding with the enemy. This seems to be what's going on a lot. This seems to be what's going on with criticism of Trump over this Virginia thing. But I will say that I agree with you that a lot of these people who are participating in these marches are not white supremacists. They are just sick of being bashed as white men. They are sick of being bashed. They are sick of being the one group that it is perfectly legal to discriminate against, right? And to call for genocide against, and all of these things, right? I'm sick of it, right? I'm absolutely freaking sick of it. But when you look at sort of the way that that what attracts these different men to these different groups, I mean, it really is sort of that the guys who go over the guys who go over to the Antifa side, you know, they're competing against Aid Skrillex and the dude from the Warren Farrell protest and all of these other kind of not very masculine men. And I'm not necessarily shitting on men who aren't particularly masculine. It's just that they're not going to be stepping into a boxing ring soon, right? And the ones who, and when you look at their tactics, right, the ones on the left, the Antifa in particular, often they put the women at the very front, right? So when there's going to be a clash, the women are the ones who are going to take the brunt of it. And that's not because they are all for equality. It's not because they think women are just as strong as men. No, it's because they know that the women will not be beaten to the degree that the men would be, right? Whereas you didn't see that with the protesters in Virginia. You didn't see that with them. They didn't have a line of women protecting their men, right? They had men right at the front. So, I mean, like it's two completely different dynamics, I think, that we're talking about here in terms of what is making men join these two different sides. I think that the men who are joining this far left side are joining it for completely different reasons than the men who are joining the far right side.
And I think there's also an element of authoritarianism versus self-sufficiency and libertarianism there too. Now, that's not to say that there are no authoritarian right-wingers, because there are, but I think when it comes to the umbrella that the alt-right encompasses, you find a lot more, ranging from libertarian to like the anarcho-capitalist end of things, where they don't necessarily want to be interfered with, even when they're facing adversity. They simply don't want their adversity to come from interference with their pursuit of happiness and interference with their attempt at self-preservation and self-sufficiency. And that's something that I think that there's a huge disconnect mentally between the two sides on that. I don't think either side really understands the other side's affinity for their end of things, where you have the authoritarian. So that's why I don't like calling them the alt left. I'd rather call them the control left, because that's what they want, control, and they really wouldn't understand the right's idea of non-interference and everything. They'd see that as, you want to get away with stuff. You just don't want anybody interfering when you're doing bad things. They couldn't comprehend the idea of a right wing that not only doesn't want interference in their pursuit of happiness and their self-sufficiency, they don't want interference even if they're facing adversity. They want to do it themselves, I think the people who are accustomed to running and telling a teacher, who are accustomed to running and calling the cops and so on, I think there's a lot of a complete lack of understanding that you can do things without an authority there to babysit you. So, and at the other end of it, I think people that are accustomed to handling their own problems and pulling themselves up by their bootstraps don't really have a feel for the idea of demanding help from somebody higher up every time you fall down. You fall down, you just pick yourself back up. You get back up and you keep going. You have to have something catastrophic happen before you look to a neighbor and say, hey, can you help me out here? And it's kind of, I like I said, I just don't think the two sides, there's no common ground there for them to connect on. And so they're kind of alien to each other. And it's almost like extreme othering. And that may be, while the ideologies themselves are very different and they're confrontational towards each other by nature, I think that bit of disconnect makes it that much more likely for clashes to turn turned to a greater degree of animosity, and I think violence may have been inevitable. And in part because on both sides, above all of the people that are involved in protesting and online conversation and commenting on news stories and stuff like that, there's people higher up in the ranks of the political ideologies that are kind of manipulating it and stirring each side against the other. So, I hate to say it, but this is something that was kind of predicted. We had a writer, Thomas Aland, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name right, wrote an article for us about, if you keep saying it's okay to insert violence into the political discussion, it's going to escalate, and the people that you're engaging in violence against are going to defend themselves. Well, it's happened, and that's where we are now. And we can go two different directions from here as a society. We can look at this and say, this isn't getting us anywhere, and that's probably not going to happen. But we can look at this and say, this isn't getting us anywhere, and it's time to tone that back, and we can just let it descend into chaos. And it looks to me, just from the way things have progressed in the last few days, that we should be watching out for more of this. And we're going to have to expect it at this point. And we're going to have to expect it from both sides. And we're going to have to understand that because somebody on one side or the other did something violent doesn't necessarily mean that the things that we're discussing on both sides shouldn't be discussed. And we're going to just have to know that if we want to go out and push for open discussion and for competing ideas and evaluation of those competing ideas until we get to the ideas that are the best ones, that we are able to decide for our society how we're going to live. It's going to take courage, because every one of us that does it is going to be at risk.
I'd say that there's one thing that the left and the right actually do have in common in this, kind of getting back to the initial topic, which is that you see all of these, and to use the term pathetic beta cuck people on the left who are just following these women who kind of, it's like they're leading the movement, and then we can follow along with them and feel like we're maybe less strong men, and we'll follow along with them. But on the right, you do actually see some of the exact same pushing of femininity and females onto a pedestal, in that, for example, on Poll, very frequently you'll see threads that are like, post pictures of white women in fields of grain because we want to protect the women. I think on some level, many of the men involved in both sides, both of them are actually doing this in some way because they believe they are protecting, or they are doing something to save women, be it as a, like, I'm trying to get pussy, which is, I think, what a lot of the guys on the left are doing. They know that they don't have many desirable traits, but they know that I can say, oh, I agree with anything that you say, and I'll just be your little bitch boy. Whereas on the right, it's the same thing. It's, well, we have to protect. It's the 14 words, right? We have to secure our future for white children. I think that's so interesting that they seem to be so disconnected, but they both worship women.
Yeah, no, they just worship them in different ways. Like there's a difference between being a knight and being a cuck, right? And I think that the alt-right side attracts sort of more high testosterone men who are willing to like fight the dragon and all of that stuff for the virtuous woman, whereas the on the left, I think it's more likely to be a specific type of male who is unable to compete with other men in that way. So I think, honestly, that ironically, because, like there is an element of socialism and identitarianism and collectivism on the alt-right, for sure, based on whiteness. But I think that essentially there's more of a libertarian sense of things. There's more of a self-sufficiency sense of things, like Hannah said. And I think that the men who are attracted to that are actually, they are going into that as to cooperate with each other. Whereas the men who are going into the alt-left are actually going into it ostensibly to cooperate with each other, but really to compete with each other. I think that that really is sort of what it is that one men are drawn to the one side because it allows them to compete, and men are drawn to the other side because it allows them to cooperate.
And I just want to add something else too. When Aiden said that they're basically guys that are looking to get laid, and we know that that's true on both sides. But I also think that there are, and I think this is where the female proxy power comes in. There are men that are on both sides, but probably a lot on the Antifa left-wing side, that they actually have women in their lives, whether it's their girlfriends, their wife, their mother, whatever, and they're doing it to keep them. So it's like the guy's looking for women and the guy's looking to keep their women. On the control left side. On the alt-right side, I actually wanted to throw this in because I'm starting to question. I know they call themselves the alt-right, but I'm starting to question whether or not the stuff they believe in would actually fit into what is described as right-wing ideas, because people like Richard Spencer actually do want socialist programs. They want things like universal health care. They want things like these sort of welfare state stuff. They just want to save it for their own people. It's just a different way of essentially like dividing people up. So I question that, because I do know that a lot of the more prominent voices in the alt-right, they actually want socialist programs, but they just want to for white people or whatever. So for their ethno state. So
that's one of the reasons why I differentiate between the libertarian right and the authoritarian right. Very much like the classic liberal would be the libertarian left, and the authoritarian left would be the so-called progressive that isn't really about progress. And I've noticed a big trend between the two authoritarian sides. They're getting closer and closer together with the things that they are doing. Now on the right, we seem to have, they're all about controlling vices that you have for the sake of enjoyment. And the left seems to be all about controlling the accumulation and distribution and use of wealth or property or equity. And it's but they do the same thing in relation to their pet areas of authority. And that's how we ended up with, these huge welfare programs, and how we end up with this idea that if somebody has a lot of money, then somebody else can't have a lot of money, like money being a finite resource, which completely ignores the existence of equity value in things, and equity value in people even. I mean, how can you? There are actresses and singers and so on that insure body parts for millions of dollars. I think Tina Turner's legs were insured. So you can't really say equity doesn't exist, but this kind of thing gets treated as though having a lot means you've taken it from someone else. And then at the other end of it, you have the authoritarian right doing the same thing with if people are engaged in sexual activities that they disapprove, that somehow takes away from their morality, their personal morality, and their personal lifestyle choices. And the same thing with drugs and alcohol and any other vice that you can think of that's just people do it because they like to do it. And you end up with prohibition, which, as I've said before, accomplishes nothing except to create a black market, organized crime, and a wave of death and destruction. And it never gets rid of the thing that's been prohibited. So I guess they really are. They're the same entity. And it's almost like you could almost see something beyond that set of entities going, okay, your turn. Okay, now it's your turn. And there's just this tennis match, and it's there to keep us all busy. But in any case, that seems to be an inspiration for sort of a significant amount of crackdown. Either end, a significant amount of crackdown on the general public. And this isn't something that necessarily all comes from women, but if you look at it, a great deal of force is wielded in the name of redistribution of wealth, in the name of controlling people's vices, micromanaging people's habits, and including their health, and so on. So, I mean, we're seeing the same kind of pattern there. Somebody comes along with a cause, and the next thing you know, there's proxy violence.
Well, I do want to say, to bring it back on topic, right? In terms of prohibition and stuff like that. I mean, like, one of the discussions that I was having online recently with someone, he said, if you want to know how domestic violence against women, blah blah blah, you just go and look into the the lead up to prohibition and all of that stuff, right? And it's like, yeah, I know they use domestic violence against women to justify prohibition. I know that the teetotalers, the abolition, the prohibitionists went town to town and put on plays where these mild-mannered men would have a couple of drinks and then start beating their wives in order to change public sentiment against alcohol, to make people against alcohol, because alcohol makes men beat their wives, right? I know all of that, right? And so you look at this sort of, and you look at a lot of these very, very early feminists, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and all of these others who were, they were feminists they were suffragettes, but they were also prohibitionists, and they participated in this sort of public discourse that set women up as the innocent victims of men's drinking, right? And set men up as these monsters whenever they drank. And like this is the power that women have, is they could sway the opinion of a nation before they even had the vote, before any politician had to care about courting their vote, right? They could sway the opinion of a nation to the point where they were willing to change the Constitution to prohibit something that was part of people's everyday lives, right? Let's just get rid of it. And then what was the result? It was one of the biggest fucking disasters in American history.
Yeah, it was part of people's everyday lives for all of memorable human history, and they thought they could get rid of it. And
Yeah,
the same
based
thing
based on violence against women. Based on violence against women.
And the same thing has happened with the drug war.
And then the feminists came along in the 1970s to tell us all, to inform all of us freaking idiots, right, that beating your wife is wrong, right? Because we didn't know that before.
Fuck. Yeah, those judges that were talking about bringing back the whipping post for wife beaters, they didn't know what they were talking about, right? I mean, that never happened before. So, no, this
Oh, yeah, no. And that one judge in the U.S. who was famous for offering the women, the battered woman, he would say, well, you can have the sheriff administer the flogging, and his arm will be stronger than yours, and the pain will be greater. Or you can administer the flogging, and the humiliation will be greater, and the satisfaction will be greater. Which do you choose? Right? But nobody ever knew until 1970 whatever that beating your wife is wrong.
Yeah, I think it was 78 that they went in to talk to Congress about this, and it wasn't like, this wasn't the thing that Congress was meeting about. It was part of the education department, if I recall correctly. I have a something like 400-page PDF file of the the minutes from this hearing, and it's ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous. They talked about Erin Pinsey. They talked about her work, and they quoted the passages from her book that they felt like they could use. And then having read her work and being familiar with what she did and familiar with what she said about domestic violence, those women sat in a congressional hearing and said, but there's no evidence anywhere. We've not seen any evidence anywhere of domestic violence perpetrated by women against men.
Oh yeah, no, of course not. You know, like this, it's infuriating, right? Because women in the Middle East are the only demographic, right, that is protected by any kind of legal construct from violence by a spouse, right? Like what I'm saying is that if a woman goes to a court in the Middle East and says, my husband is beating me, right, and he is going beyond what is permitted, right, there is a limit on what he is permitted, he has gone beyond that, she has recourse, she has all kinds of legal recourse under the family law system in all kinds of Middle Eastern countries, right? But if she freaking beats the shit out of him on a daily basis with a fucking skillet or a rolling pin, right? He has to deal with that himself within the confines that are allowed him, right? He has no recourse to go to a court and, I don't know, get a peace bond against her or anything like that, because that's his problem, okay? And that's the way everything was when Blackstone wrote his commentaries, you know, in the West, was there were limits placed upon a husband as to how they could lay their hands on their wives. But there was no framework within the law, right, that allowed a man to go to a court of law and say, my wife has put her hands on me, please do something about it. Right?
No,
so women
definitely...
women have been the only party to a marriage that has historically enjoyed any kind of legal protection against violence and injury and restraint by a partner.
And we could talk about all of the issues with Islam and how it is unfair to both genders.
Everybody.
Right.
Yeah, everyone involved under it. And so, yeah, what happens instead? You don't have a legal recourse, so what do? You go, you end up with violence in other ways, because there is no legal recourse. And at least, I'm not surprised with a lot of the situations we have here with so many men being so dissatisfied, because in the West, women have the only legal recourse.
There was that, it was actually Casey Johnson just wrote an article in the Washington Post today, I believe, about the student at Amherst, the male student who just had his lawsuit settled with the college. For major dollars, I'm assuming. The only public statement by the college was the matter has been resolved. That's it. 5 words. That's all they said.
They're not going to admit anything else.
No, but the incident was, I mean, what happened, by all accounts, what seems to have happened was he was like super freaking drunk, possibly passed out drunk, right? And a female student performed fellatio on him while he was so drunk that he had no memory of it. Then she sent a bunch of text messages to her her resident advisor and her friends saying, I fucked up. I just did something with, my roommate's boyfriend. Right? I totally fucked up. And she said, I wasn't a victim in this. I totally did it. I was the one, right? In the text messages. And, of course, he has no idea what even happened. So he wakes up in the morning thinking, I just passed out and had a good night's sleep, I guess. 18 months later, she files a rape complaint against him. right? To essentially, I don't know, weasel her way out of having to explain to her roommate that, you know, she had participated in a sexual act with her roommate's boyfriend, right? That was the first that this guy found out what had happened, right? So immediately upon realizing, holy shit, some chick sucked my dick while I was asleep or passed out or blacked out drunk or whatever, right? Completely incapacitated. Holy shit, this happened to me. He tries to file a complaint with the school. They said, no, you can't, because that would constitute retaliation against a victim.
Yeah,
right?
it takes a tough woman to be a victim of a guy that's passed out.
Yeah, and then he gets expelled, right? And they didn't allow him to introduce any of the text messages or anything like that, right? The whole thing was over within 3 days, apparently, and he was out, kicked out of school. And then he finds out afterwards from other people, oh yeah, she totally texted me, blah, 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 blah. So all of this stuff came out in his lawsuit, right? That there was this evidence, right? Sitting there, it is exculpatory evidence sitting there on her phone and on other people's phones that, you know, could have kept him in school, right? But no. And the school fought him, tried to get the whole case dismissed a bunch of times, right? Denied any wrongdoing, blah, blah, blah. And they will not admit to having fucked up. And the whole thing is just astounding to me, because he was literally a victim of sexual assault, but because he wasn't aware of it, because he was incapacitated, right? And she decided she was going to file a false allegation with the school. He was prevented from actually filing a report with the school that he'd been victimized. Like, I'm blown away by this shit.
I see that happens in the legal system to a degree too. My friend who went through the 7 years in hell case, his sister and her family were stalked by the vexatious litigant. She went to their home, trespassed on their property, vandalized their property, and eventually actually harmed one of their pets. And so they went to court for restraining orders against her to keep her away from them so that she wouldn't do stuff like this anymore. And the judge, they had to fight tooth and nail for the restraining order. The judge didn't want to give him a restraining order because it was a domestic case and she had a restraining order against, you know, the sister's brother. And so they go to court, and the thing that ended up leading to the restraining order being awarded was that the vexatious litigant screwed up. The attack had been on one of 3 dogs. They are 3 different breeds, 3 different colors, 3 different sizes. And she screwed up and said which dog she did not attack. And in an outburst, actually, in response to the niece saying, "And she stabbed my dog." You know, "I didn't stab your little black dog." And the niece looks at the judge and says, I didn't say which dog I was talking about. I have 3 dogs. None of them look like the others. And that was it. You know, even the Artemis House representative that was there looked at the vexatious litigant like, "What the hell, lady? Did you just gave yourself away?" She dropped her jaw, she turned her head around, and the judge awarded restraining orders to the sister and the niece, but not the brother-in-law, because he's a man and he can protect himself. I mean, how bad is that?
Oh my god!
And
like
it took her admitting by accident to having been on the property and hurt one of their pets before the judge would even consider, you know, he really couldn't get out of it at that point. And he was looking for any excuse to not give that restraining order. And then after it was awarded, they ended up with nails in all of the tires of their cars within a couple of weeks, and they called the cops, and they reported the problem, and the cops told them, Artemis House already contacted us. We cannot enforce this restraining order because it's retaliation in a domestic violence case.
You know what's hilarious? Okay, because I mean, and this is something that, you know, like, okay, I'm publicizing this. I'm sure that there are lots of people who know this, but you know, I got a frantic phone call from a friend of mine on behalf of a friend of hers, and granted, he totally screwed up, and he essentially deserves to, like, not be exactly happy. I mean, like, this is a guy who was with a young woman. She had a child from a previous relationship who was, you know, quite old at that point, like maybe 7, 8 years old, right? And he talked her into having another child, and they had a child together. And then he spent 2 years convincing her. She was like, I'm done. I don't want any more kids. Spent 2 years convincing her to have another one. And then while she was pregnant with that child, he cheated on her and left her for another woman. Okay, so this is not the greatest guy in the world. Okay, this is not a guy that I would, if I saw him, I would want to smack him. Okay, why would you fucking do that? Okay. But what she did was, they live in a tiny, tiny little rural town, and the nearest city is like 2 hours drive away. And after he did this, she went away for a weekend, a long weekend, down to the city, and then she comes back and presents him with papers that will, and he's already been paying her, just sort of on a handshake, this exorbitant sum of money every month in spousal support and all of this, right? And child support. And he's already dipping into his savings and all of this to pay this. He can't actually afford to sustain it, but he's been paying it on a handshake because he wants to be, because I guess he feels guilty, which he should. But so it's complicated. But so she hands him this contract that essentially says that he's going to continue to pay this sum of money plus an extra $500 a month for the next 5 years, right? Until the children are old enough, all of the children are old enough to be in kindergarten. And so that she won't have to work and she won't have to blah, blah, blah. And he says, well, I think I'm going to talk to a lawyer about this, right? And then he starts phoning, right? And there's only one lawyer in the immediate area, and he doesn't do family law. So he starts phoning the nearest city. And every time he talks to them and, oh, yeah, we can help you. We can help you. And then he gives his name. And then they say, oh, I'm sorry, we can't help you. Because she went and she poisoned every well in that town. She spent that 3 days going and getting a free half-hour consultation with every single legal office in that city. And the moment that she did that, they cannot accept him as a client because it would be a conflict of interest. It would be a violation of confidentiality, even though she's not their client, right? Because they know things that she told them, right? They cannot take him as a client. So she essentially poisoned an entire city's worth of lawyers against him, right? This is the kind of shit that women will do.
Yeah, it's not violent, but you can't tell me that that's not some bullshit.
That you can't tell me that that's not aggressive.
Exactly.
Well,
Yeah,
it's not
exactly.
immediately violent. But think of it this way. That was her first domino in a chain that ends in you keep working at the level that you're working and earning at the level that you're earning forever. Or the cops will show up at your door and you're screwed. You have no defense.
And you said that he was already struggling to begin with, and then she demanded more money. So the chances are good that he's going to have a hell of a time trying to keep up with this new amount that she's demanding.
Oh yeah.
No,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
there are thousands of men in the United States, and I'm sure there's probably thousands in Canada as well, who are in debtor's prison right now. They don't call it that. They don't admit that that's what it is. They call them deadbeats. But they're in debtor's prison right now because of things like imputed income. Imputed income is when the judge says you should be making more money than you are, because you can just go out and earn money however way you want, whatever way you want, however much you want, any time you want, and nothing will stop you. And that's the
Yeah.
way the judges talk about it. And
If you were a chartered accountant, and you lost your job, well, you should still be earning like a chartered accountant, and you should still be earning even after we take away your certificate, your credentials. You should still be earning like a chartered accountant, and you should still be earning like a chartered accountant once we take away your driver's license.
And
right?
when we put you in jail, they
Yeah.
still
And then you have a
charge
criminal
child
record.
support to those
Yeah.
guys while they are in jail. That debt continues to build up while they are in jail, and they are not allowed to earn the money they need to pay it. The judge will say, well, that's your fault for ending up in jail. You still owe the money. So I mean,
this
is a situation where force is used. They're incarcerated, so they've basically, like, at the beginning we described, they've been kidnapped and they're being held against their will. And this is violence. That is a violent thing to do to somebody. To lock somebody up so that they have to stay in the same place. They can't go and work. They don't have the freedom of movement, and they're in an environment full of criminals. That is a violent act. So,
Agreed.
That is the first domino in a chain of proxy violence.
If I could, I would like to almost kind of give my own experience with that, which is what happened to my dad. Is that my mom said, I'm going to move halfway across the country, and the judge basically paid for her to do that because she said she needed to do that because she needed to find a job. When I would go visit my dad, he was living basically in a rat nest because he couldn't afford anything else. Every single penny that he had he could not afford. I remember going to see my dad, who, by the way, was making at that point about 6 figures. He was living in a one-room apartment. He couldn't afford to buy a gallon of milk because every single penny he had was going to my mom, who decided to live across the country to, quote, find a job. And the judge absolutely supported this entire maneuver. They just said, fine, he's going to pay for you to move. He's going to pay for you to sit on your ass while you try to find a job. It was absolutely absurd. And, nobody, like, how much freedom did he have as a person? I know, I saw him. That was the worst I ever saw my dad. I love my dad. I've never seen him in a worse state. Because they just said, you know what? Here's what you have to do. Is that not violence, psychological, financial violence?
Oh, it's awful. Like I met a guy recently, sat down, talked to him, and he essentially said, over the last 5 years, I have paid my ex-wife more than $600,000 in tax-free money, right? Because he has to pay the tax on that before he hands it to her, right? More than $600,000. And she still tells our 2 kids that I don't pull my weight. I don't pay my fair share in this whole freaking thing, right? And I'm just like, I'm just blown away. I'm like, how do men tolerate this? How can they? I mean, because he's a guy who he goes up north, right? Like from Grand Prairie or Fort McMurray or wherever the frick. He works 21 days on, 7 days off. He flies out and flies back at the company's expense, and he lives in a fucking work camp. He lives in essentially a room with an internet connection and a communal toilet shared with 16 other guys. That's what he does, right? To earn this money. And she's essentially made over $100,000 a year in tax-free money, and she's still not fucking satisfied. She still thinks that he's not pulling his weight. He's not contributing what he should. And I like every single time I meet one of these guys who's fucked in this way, right? I think to myself, you know, like, is she still coming over to your house 3 times a week, cleaning, cooking, and sucking your dick? Like, why are you still having to support this bitch?
And it's because the state doesn't want to support her, and they think the only other option is to dump it on the guy. And that's been going on
I guess there's no
for
cash
generations.
Value. I guess there's no fucking there's no way for a man to get welfare in the form of, you know, cooking, cleaning, and getting his dick sucked.
Nope.
The government's not going to pay for that.
They don't care about that. Nope.
And people will argue also, oh, it's not being done to the man. The money they're taking from the man is for the children, even when he's in prison and isn't making any money. That's clearly for the children's benefit, that they're still building up that debt that he'll probably never be able to pay down in most cases.
Well, yeah, you know, my answer on that.
They can't see their dad because their dad's in prison, right? You know,
my answer on that.
Kids.
It's a lot of these women who have kids and no husband are in that position by choice. 70% of divorce is initiated by women, and the majority of single moms were never married. So you have... she either became a single mom by divorce, and I guess that leaves a 70% chance that it was her idea, or she became a single mom by giving birth to a child and then choosing to retain custody. Because you don't have to retain custody. You can abandon custody to the father. If you have family that wants custody of your baby, you can abandon custody to your family. In at least the United States, there's also safe haven abandonment, in which case you're not dealing with people. There's adoption if the father doesn't want anything to do with the child, and you don't want anything to do with the child. So there's 4 different ways a woman can get out of being a single custodial mom, even if she has already given birth.
What I find hilarious is in Canada, and I know this because a friend of mine actually looked into it, and she's been trying to essentially, because she went on welfare. She was pregnant. She was in incredible financial crisis. And, you know, she's like 6 months pregnant. Who's going to hire her? Right. So essentially she went on welfare for about 14 months. And then as soon as she could possibly manage it, she went back to work. But during that 14 months, of course, welfare went and dinged the father, right? And she has been attempting to negotiate with the father to sever his paternity rights because he doesn't want them. He doesn't want any of it. And have her new guy adopt their son. And this has been a years-long process. And the only way that she could actually absolve the biological father of his responsibility is if there is another man who is prepared to take responsibility and who is seen by the courts as capable of taking responsibility.
So the court doesn't judge whether or not you're a fit mother. You can just pop one out and boom, you get welfare, you get child support, you get treated like a queen. But if you actually care enough to want to take care of a child that you didn't even father as a man, the court is going to sniff up your butt and see if you're a good enough guy.
Well, what's hilarious too is that so essentially, if the biological father of this child was a heroin addict and a like 3-time freaking convict and the whole bit, right? And like they would rather milk him for cash than transfer responsibility to a man who is not an upstanding middle-class citizen with no kind of unsavory history whatsoever, right? Because, hey, you know, we got to have standards here, right? And like, I'm just blown away by this because
it's not about standards.
A woman can abandon responsibility for her child and transfer the full responsibility for that child to the state through safe haven abandonment, right? Whereas if she wants to absolve a man, the biological father, of responsibility, or the man whose name is on the birth certificate, of responsibility for that child, she has to find another man who the court finds suitable to take that over, right? That means that in our society, at least in the legal sense, paternity, fatherhood means more than motherhood, right? Which is absolutely insane to me.
Well, what it really boils down to is that the people who work in that area know that their jobs depend on keeping people stuck in that system. And if they end up with people being too independent, if they end up with people not needing welfare, if they end up not having fathers to collect child support from, because these problems get solved because the mothers do things like this mother wants to do, they're out of a job. So they're going to bend over backwards to not fix anything. But and that kind of goes back to what I was saying about women have 4 different ways that they can choose not to be single custodial mothers. And even in this situation of divorce, a woman can choose to be divorced without choosing to be a single custodial mother. She again can relinquish custody to the father. So anytime somebody complains about how these kids are going to be living in poverty if the father doesn't pay up, my answer is, gosh, those are some abusive mothers, aren't they? Because they're putting these kids in this situation willingly, knowingly, out of their own interests, putting these kids in this situation, and they want to turn around and blame the man when there's 70% of divorce is initiated by women, and the majority of single moms are never married moms, never married the father. And so they don't have to put kids in this situation, and they're doing it anyway. How is that not abuse?
Well, what got me is because when I ended my marriage, it was a unilateral decision on my part, right? And I essentially said to him that child support is just no, right? Like, we're both struggling. You're struggling more than I am, and I'm not gonna put that on you, right? But the court, when we were negotiating divorce, my lawyer essentially said that there was no judge that would sign off on a divorce. There was no way that I would actually be able to financially extricate myself from my ex without a child support order in place. So he and I sat down and we decided minimum wage, 35 hours a week, because if he's not earning an income, the judge is going to impute one on him, right? And we needed to figure out what's the lowest possible amount that a judge would actually agree to and still allow us to have our divorce. And that's the most absurd thing to me, right? I haven't done anything to try to collect it, and I don't think I ever will. I would rather he spend that money to, on his subsequent child or on himself, because he really doesn't have a whole lot of money, or to come and visit the kids, or to, hang out and do things with the kids when they go visit him, right? I would much rather he have that little bit of extra money, right? So but when I said to him, children, right? That meant that I would take responsibility for the children. That didn't mean, oh, these children are mine, but you're going to pay for them. What the fuck is that?
That is women not thinking of their children as little people.
No, they're pawns. It's actually, there's something called parental alienation syndrome. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's yeah. And that's exactly what this is in many ways, is that this is essentially using the children as pawns and using them as I'll play them against the father. I'll play them against the government in order to achieve my financial and my societal goals. This is just another form, though, of domestic violence by proxy. Absolutely. Of using the children and Karen was talking about this of the your dad doesn't pay enough money, he doesn't pony up enough. That's all a part of that, because of course, how does this get played out if the things don't work out in your favor? Well, you can obviously externalize it onto the father who's just not paying up enough money if things are bad, or if you just feel like it because you're being vindictive, because you're engaging in domestic violence, from an external standpoint, by going outside and being, removed from the direct situation of not directly even interacting with this individual, the person that you've had these children with, but you can still engage in a form of violence against them, psychological, and really to estrange people from their children, I believe, is one of the most horrible pieces of violence or just terrible things you could do to somebody.
Yeah, there's actually a young lady, and I cannot think of her name, who was a victim of parental alienation when she was a child and her parents were divorced, who has spoken extensively about it on YouTube. She's talked about the psychological damage it does and the pain it caused.
I know her.
You know what I'm talking about.
She's from Britain. She moved to Australia with her dad.
And
she took her videos down though.
Yeah,
I actually got to meet her.
She probably had to.
I got to meet her in person, and her name was Emma.
Yeah.
And she's an absolute sweetie, and like she absolutely, she was just like, and what is really absurd about the UK is that family court proceedings are secret,
and they are here too if the judge decides he wants them to be. That's that also happens in Canada. And it's more likely to happen if Child Protective Services gets involved. Child Protective Services, CPS, the only 3 letters scarier in the United States, at least, than IRS. I would rather have the IRS sicked on me 1,000 times than CPS once. And yeah, they have secret hearings where you're not allowed to talk about what happened in the case. The same thing can happen in divorce cases in the United States and Canada as well. I've spoken to several fathers who have been through, really been through hell in the court system, in the family court system, where judges have put gag orders on them discussing their cases, using their ex-wives or their children's privacy as an excuse, when in reality, what's going on is the judge is doing something that is essentially illegal and very abusive, giving custody to a parent who is a drug addict or has a severe mental health issue, not just, symptoms, not just depression or something like that, but is hearing voices and listening to them or something of a similar nature. And the judge doesn't want the public hearing that he's doing ridiculous things that are dangerous to the child with regards to custody. And
yeah, this would be a lot of what Gary Treisman.
Mm-hmm.
He's the guy who invited me to the New York Libertarian State Party's annual convention, that first speaking engagement, or second, real speaking engagement that I was able to get. And his ex, in conjunction with a social worker, state paid social worker, the guardian ad litem, and a psychiatrist, put his daughter, who was I think 6 at the time, on it's an off-label use of an antipsychotic medication because she just wouldn't stop talking about how she missed her dad. And this medication has been shown to cause damage to the heart muscle. It's been shown to cause obesity. It's been shown to cause heart palpitations. It's been shown to cause lightheadedness and all kinds of and permanent health damage. right? When used in children. It's only supposed to be used in adults. And I'm looking at pictures that he sent me of his daughter before the divorce, and she's just a perfectly healthy looking child. And then pictures from 2 years later, and she's morbidly obese, right? And she's talking about, how her mom just, she just doesn't want me to see you and blah, blah, blah. And he has supervised visitation. He gets dinged. He literally took her to McDonald's and bought her French fries at McDonald's during a supervised visit, and then her mom took him to court because you shouldn't be feeding her junk food, and so therefore visitation is done for the next 3 months. Right. So, I mean, like, this is absolutely insane, right? What's going on with some of these things, with some of these cases. It's unbelievable. Like, what kind of mother would allow her 7-year-old child to be put on a dangerous drug that causes permanent health problems?
What kind of mother would interfere with the father's parenting of the child?
Well,
I mean, if you love your kids, you give a rat's ass about your kids. Unless there is something genuinely, seriously wrong. Unless that guy is in the rare situation of actually being a bad person. He's not in the majority. He's that one guy that belongs in jail for something, Unless it's that guy. What kind of evil bitch would take a child's father away? And that's, to me, I think that's horrible.
Oh, no, my ex is no angel, right? My ex is absolutely no fucking angel. But, even when he was living in a single hotel room without a telephone, above a bar.
He still saw his kids.
He still saw his kids overnight. There was enough room on either side of the bed for the kids to stretch out on the floor, so I would still send them to him to see them overnight, because, they're not spending all of their time in the hotel room. They're going out and freaking walking on beaches, and
they're getting time with their dad.
Having ice cream cones and having time with their dad, right? And it's like, it wasn't the best fucking situation in terms of, like, they didn't each have their own fucking bedroom with their own, decor chosen by them. Yeah, like, whatever. It's their dad.
Yeah.
Like,
there are a lot of things a kid's willing to give up to maintain a relationship with both parents.
One of the things that Desmond Morris said about co-sleeping, right, for babies, right, is that a baby would rather sleep in a flooded gutter next skin to skin with its mom, right, than to sleep in the most luxuriously appointed nursery in the world on the other end of the house.
This is basic oxytocin production. It takes about 5 seconds for the human body to start producing oxytocin from skin-to-skin contact. And this is particularly, there's more oxytocin produced when there's the parent and child contact, physical contact. That absolutely is the case. Yeah, put them next to their parents. They're happier. It is the pleasure hormone.
It makes a difference in life or death for some. When you have a preemie, one of the things that they tell you is your baby's chance of survival will be dramatically increased with skin-to-skin contact. And there's a preemie in my family, and that is her dad was the one who carried her around because he was big and strong, and he could also carry around the monitors and everything that she had, the little itty bitty teeny weeny blood pressure cuff and all that stuff. And so he just went around the hospital, the ICU ward for babies, shirtless, and carrying this little baby that could fit in the palm of your hand, and up against his chest, and that was that was how she survived. And I mean,
Do any of you remember? Do any of you remember the viral photo that led to a complaint to Child Protective Services? It was a viral photo of a man in the shower, sitting on, sort of a ledge or on the edge of the tub or something like that, holding his 2-year-old, and they were both naked. And his 2-year-old had some kind of horrible stomach flu or food poisoning or something. So there was like stuff coming out, and they were both naked, and he just was cradling this exhausted child who was just sitting on his lap, sleeping against his chest. And it was the most sweet photo I think I've ever seen of a man with a little baby, right? I mean, because 2 years old or a year and a half old or whatever, still a baby. And they got reported that the wife took the picture, right, and posted it on her Facebook. She was a professional photographer, no less. And it went viral, and then they got reported to Child Services for potential pedophilia.
That's
right?
disgusting.
And I was just like, are you, this is one of the most tender fucking moments. Like, I had a kid who had chicken pox so bad when he was a year old, my oldest, that he had chicken pox on his tongue, on his penis, and on the whites of his eyeballs.
I had a friend that happened to when she was little.
And I would take, and he had horrible diarrhea with it too, right? And so I would put the diaper on as loose as possible. It was one of those ones that you fold and pin, so that it would just leak out through the legs, when it came out, because otherwise it would be too tight against all of his chicken pox that he had all over his private area, all over his bum, everywhere, right? On his anus, everywhere. He had them everywhere. We put calamine lotion on him. He would be like a ghost, right? Because he was head to toe calamine lotion. And then 5-6 times a day, I would strip him down, strip the diaper off of him, and take him into the shower and have a cool shower with him and just hold him and let the water just wash over him, right? And that makes me a pedophile, I guess, too, right?
No,
because
for comforting your sick child.
You're the mom.
Jeez. I'd hate to say what they'd say about my experience as a kid, because there were times when I was so sick I didn't even know what was going on around me. The one that was the weirdest was when I was recovering. I got encephalitis from a mosquito bite, and we don't know exactly what virus caused it. It was suspected to be the equine type, but it happened. It came on so fast, like the symptoms manifested within half an hour, that there's also a suspicion that it might have been an allergic reaction or a combination of things. The mosquito that bit me, it bit me in December inside the house, and they suspect it grew in the sump pump. So I'm recovering from this 6 weeks later after almost dying in the hospital, spending a night with coma brainwaves, according to the nurse, and so on. And as I was going through this, and I'm getting better, I had the condition of high fever, where you have weird stuff happen and hallucinations and all of that. And head pressure can cause you to lose all of your senses, temporarily or permanently. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I really had to pee, because you drink a lot when you have a fever, and you push fluids when you have any illness that's infectious, because it helps to clean out your system. It helps to get anything that's going to be we want to get rid of. So I get up. Now I remember standing up, and I remember everything going black, and I remember the sound. I had one of those heaters that has a ribbon of metal, and it heats up, electricity goes through it, heats up, turns orange, and buzzes. And the buzzing stopped, and the orange disappeared. It was completely black. I couldn't see, I couldn't smell the heater anymore, nothing. It was just all gone. And I remember reaching out, but I don't remember getting a hold of anything. And when I finally started to get my senses back, it was like 5 minutes past on my alarm clock. And so I decided, I was up, I was going to go to the bathroom. And I went in and did my thing. And I got up from the toilet, and I didn't have a bedpost to grab. And the next thing I remember was, and I laying there on the floor in my underwear. And I'm 12 years old, and my dad is standing over me going, "Are you okay? Hannah, are you awake? Wake up, Hannah," And he picked me up and put me back in my room. And this is what parents do. My mom wouldn't have been able to pick me up. My mom, by that time, she had a devastating car accident that damaged her body very badly, and she's had severe chronic pain for most of my life. But my dad, I was at 12 years old. I was 5'6", and before the encephalitis, I weighed 130 pounds. Afterward, I weighed 118. And he just lifted me up like I was nothing and carried me into my room, put me back to bed, didn't say a thing, just asked, if I was all right.
I had almost a very similar experience, not with encephalitis. I can't have children because I have a very extreme endometriosis. I was probably 14, and I stumbled naked into the bathroom, and my dad found me and carried me back to my bed. There was nothing wrong about that. I mean, it's not comfortable, but that's what a parent does for their child, because they love them, and because that's an important part of being a parent, man. I was just in so much pain. That's normal. There's nothing weird about that. I mean, it's not comfortable. It's not wrong.
No, and it's infuriating to see men being singled out for this. I mean, like, we have pictures. Yeah, we have pictures, because before, when our older two were small, we have pictures of the kids. Jack, my oldest, used to play explorer. The kids used to love going around without diapers. Absolutely 100% love, being naked. That's what kids love, is being naked. And he would put on his rubber boots, and he'd put a salad bowl on his head, and he would grab the spaghetti server, and he would play Intrepid Explorer, right? And we snapped a picture of him, and then we took a picture of the kids in the bath with me and the kids in the bath with their dad, and we took them into the photo place, because this was before digital cameras and before we owned a computer, and nobody batted an eye about the fact that, my ex was naked in a bathtub with a 8-month-old baby. Nobody ever freaking cared.
You could shock these namby-pambies if you let them know that women are also naked when they give birth.
Oh yeah, no, and literally they're forcing their children to touch their vaginas.
Yeah, so it's totally wrong. We're just gonna have to end birth forever, because it's obviously some strange form of pedophilia.
Actually, he's 15 years old now. He just turned 15 a couple of weeks ago, and he wanted to know what a cesarean section was. So I told him, and he's like, "Oh my god, that's so gross! That's gross!"
When your child pulls up in the rib cage, and you have to go in after him with a knife.
Yeah, you want to know what's gross? You were literally inside my vagina, Sam. Right? Oh, you were inside my sexual parts, right? You were where the penis goes, right? And he's like, "Oh God, stop it, Mom!" And then he went away, because that was what I was aiming for. I was aiming to make him go away and leave me to do my work. So,
and there you go, relational aggression from the honey badgers.
Talking about my period wasn't working.
I think. Speaking of proxy violence and relational aggression and all that we have talked this subject to death. So, unless...
Oh, we went way off topic, too.
To a degree. Although, when you think about it, everything that we have talked about has a connection to proxy violence. Using false accusations was kind of on the list. So...
Kind of, a little bit, yeah.
I have a question though for Brian before we end the stream. Was there anything, we usually have a shill for something at the end of the show. Was there anything that we had to shill this time around?
Oh, I
No.
know.
Oh,
I know.
Carrie's got something apparently.
I'm going to shill the National Coalition for Men's 40th anniversary and conference. So it's a conference and party. It's 2 days on the 14th and 15th of September in San Diego at the glorious Best Western Plus Hacienda Hotel in Old Town San Diego. It boasts a pool and hot tub, an exercise room, ironing boards for everybody, and allegedly stunning views of colorful slushy drinks with little umbrellas in them and mostly empty tequila bottles. If you are in the San Diego area and you would like to attend and see speakers like yours truly and others such as Fred Hayward, who is in the Red Pill, Mark Angelucci, who is also in the Red Pill, Cassie J, maker of the Red Pill, Tim Golditch, author of Loving Men and Respecting Women, and Vladik Filler, our favorite falsely accused person ever. I would suggest that you go to http://conference.ncfm.org. Find out the details. It's $300 to attend. You have to be a member or a donor, but you can do that by donating as little as $1. And so I'll be talking about Bill C-51, 2017 in Canada, and its implications on the ability of the falsely accused to defend themselves against wrongful accusations. And and I just want to plug Harry Crouch, the president, who's president of NCFM, who's arranging all of this, who is not just the most interesting man in the world. He's also an Adonis with a killer fashion sense and abs that make the ladies swoon. He totally did not pay me to say that. So go look it up and be there if you're in the San Diego area on September 14th and 15th.
All right. And with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and take us on out.